when you start a private company, do you declare a number of shares at the very start or when you decide to go public? Yeah. So the only time you declare the number of shares is when you raise money from other people, high net worth investors or venture capital firms, or if you hire employees and you want to give them part of the company. That's when you create shares. And I would always get a lawyer, please, to draft up any sort of documentation that has to do with shares or raising money. Always, always, always. And you can go to LegalZoom.com to get this done. And I'm not sponsored by anybody. I want to humbly help if I can. But at LegalZoom.com, you can talk to lawyers on the cheap. I do it all the time there when it comes to trademarking and copyrighting my stuff. Then every time you raise money, what happens is more shares are created and you as the founder get diluted because you're selling shares to a new party. Everybody gets diluted. However, the earlier stage big investors like the venture capital firms, they have what's called the Prorata right to buy additional shares each time you raise more money so that they still own the same percent of the company and they do not get diluted. They have that right. They don't have to execute their Prorata, but quite often they do. And by the time you go public, then what happens is there's two different share classes, usually in an IPO, meaning when you go to list on the stock market. And those are as follows. There's primary shares, and then there's secondary shares. Now, primary shares are new shares that are created, so everybody gets diluted. And everyone's okay with getting diluted that works at the company that owns shares because the price is going to be much, much higher for those new primary shares. Then there are what are called secondary shares that are sold. And what secondary shares are shares that are currently owned by employees or investors or you, the entrepreneur, the founder of the company, and you get to sell in the IPO if you want to. And venture capital firms usually sell the bulk of their shares in secondary shares when a company goes public because they have to harvest their investment. You know, for me, for example, the last notable one I did was a company called Nimble Storage. The ticker was NMBL. It went public, founded by a brilliant man named Varun Mehta. And Suresh Masudian was the CEO. He's the best CEO on the planet. And 6 months after Nimble Storage went public, and they got acquired eventually, but the ticker was NMBL. 6 months after they got acquired, or 6 months after they went public, when the stock was, I think, about $30 years ago, I sold every share. And so those were secondary shares I was allowed to sell. Now, I had to wait 6 months because when you work in venture capital and the company goes public that you invested in, you're locked up for 6 months. Then you can sell. And that's why quite often what happens is you see stocks go down a bunch 6 months after the IPO date. But I had to sell. And I always sell because it's a large percentage of my liquid net worth. Some venture capital investors don't ever sell. And the last thing I'll say on this topic is there's a brilliant man who I've met named John Doerr. And he's one of the top dudes at a great venture capital firm called Kleiner Perkins. And one of the partners at Kleiner Perkins guest lectured in one of my classes. And he said that John Doerr has never sold a single share of Amazon since he invested in one of the earlier venture capital rounds. And his return is over 50,000%. It's true. It's crazy. But John Doerr is much more wealthy than I am. Yeah. But basically what happens is 6 months after every IPO, venture capitalists are allowed to sell at that point.